Welcome all to part 7 of the Creating Passionate Readers series. We just have this session and then one more, and we will have navigated all of the values of creating passionate readers. Our topic for today is going to be about merging the classics with independent reading. And I think this is going to resonate with a lot of us who often feel like, wait, you're telling me to throw the baby out with the bathwater? I can't teach whole class novels. I can't teach the classics. This is going to give you some assurance that there is a time and a place to provide that whole class novel with these values of independent reading. So we're going to continue to uncover the solution to our reading problem, that students don't like to read, that they're often not reading even when they're assigned, by providing relevant and meaningful reading and learning experiences. And a lot of the work and the research that you're going to hear from me about today is from this book called No More Fake Reading by Barrett Gordon. And I have a copy of it. If any of you guys would like to borrow it, you just let me know and I will send it to you via inter-school mail. But she does a wonderful job of arguing that we should minimize the role of, but not abandon the classics, right? There is a time and place for those whole class novels. But before we kind of dive into that further, let's just kind of break out into some rooms and explore the concept of what value do classic texts offer to students. There's a lot of different things that classics can offer our students, but I want to point out two that are especially important. Classic texts give students what we call cultural capital. What I mean by that is students will start to gain the sense that the other kinds of media that they interact with, whether it's in TV, movies, other literature pieces, that they're not created in this vacuum. So when they are listening to Spotify and they hear Selena Gomez sing The Heart Wants What It Wants, they'll recognize, oh, Emily Dickinson wrote that first. I wonder what Selena Gomez is trying to say by alluding to this Emily Dickinson piece. And so they can start to be more critical consumers of the media that they're intaking because they have this cultural capital. The second thing is that classics can activate parts of our brain that popular literature does not. Goldman did a study in 2012 and found that when students are exposed to complex texts that require high levels of inference, brain activity expands. Now, I'd argue that there's a lot of what we might perceive as popular literature that does offer high levels of inference. But if a text does not offer that, it doesn't provide the same brain activity that we're hoping for students as they read. So what makes a classic a classic? I think this is often something we struggle with as well. Let's go back to those same breakout rooms and let's discuss this question. This was a hard question. All of us were kind of wrestling with it in different ways. And I think it's because maybe there's not a right answer. We need to make sure that the definition of a classic remains broad and flexible, but it must offer a unique reading experience by requiring deep levels of inference. And I want to give Lisa a shout out because she really, I think, also hit on another point that it must provide insight into the human experience in some way. And by exploring that human experience through complex writing, with the way they attempt to portray the literature, that helps us see a good idea of what a classic could be. But the definition should always be changing. We should be adapting it, and it must be broad, right? There's no little pigeonhole that we can put any definition of a classic. So there are two approaches that we might consider when incorporating classics into our teaching, into our classrooms. The blended model is one, and the whole class model is the second. We're going to start by exploring the whole class novel first. The whole class model. There are a couple of pros and cons for each of these models, but some pros for the whole class is that students will read a classic text cover to cover. And as a result of that, they're building stamina with this complex text. And that's one of our goals as part of being a CPR teacher, is that we want to build stamina for reading for our kids. And that means eyes on print. The con is that student choice is eliminated, right? We're not honoring that choice piece. And there's also less flexibility in which classics can be used. If you are assigning a book to a whole class, it has to be part of our core novel approved list. And also because there's less flexibility and less choice, you have limited opportunities for differentiation based on reading abilities and based on where students are at in their reading identity. Remember last time when we talked about book clubs, we learned that reading individually is a skill, but as a community, it is an art. And a whole class novel is a communal reading experience. And so last time with book clubs, we talked about how do we know if our students are ready for communal reading experiences? It's more challenging. We talked about how it's like a rowing team. If half of the team has been training rigorously every single day, but the other half is not, that boat is not going to move as quickly or smoothly as it would be if the whole team was prepared. And so we want to make sure that every child participating in a communal reading experience is on at least a similar level to their peers. And we kind of talked about this cartoon of the stages of the reader. This is not based in research, but it's a good portrayal of what all of us kind of go through as readers. But if we can at least get kids on step 3, where books are part of their identity, that means that they have a genre, an author, a character, a series, something that they connect with, that they see, okay, I didn't like reading necessarily before, but I can connect with these kinds of books. That's a good start. And again, this is not based in reading or any research, but I found in my classroom instruction, if a student had read at least 2 books cover to cover of their choice, that was a sign to me that they might be ready for a communal reading experience. Again, that definition and that criteria is flexible. You know the students in front of you. Maybe a kid has read 2 books of their choice, but they're not quite ready for the complexity and the stamina they'll need to tackle a classic. So take that with a grain of salt. All right, so what does your semester look like when you're using this whole class model? As a CPR teacher, you're still providing independent choice for about 9 or 10 weeks, that first quarter. And then after that, you would transition to the book clubs like we talked about last week. And that can go from 4 to 5 weeks. I'd recommend keeping it tight at 4. And then the final piece would be that whole class novel. And that's usually going to be about 3 to 4 weeks. And that rounds out your semester. Now, by the time that the semester is over and a new semester begins, guess what? You get to start from square one and you get to go back to independent choice, and kids get to choose what they read again. And then they get another type of book club with a new title and a new whole class novel. And so we're scaffolding those reading experiences so that we're not missing an opportunity to continue to build those reader identities, their reader complexity, and their stamina. Now, it's important to know that with the whole class model, and just like with book clubs, the daily practices of our CPR series still applies. So students are reading at least 10 minutes a day during class time and are expected to read at least 10 minutes at home for that bare minimum of 20 minutes a day. You can always scaffold and adjust that for older grade levels, but at least 10 minutes a day at school and home is based in some research by Scholastic that I've linked there. And then teachers are conferring with at least 3 students every day and writing daily journal entries centered on their reading. It's also important to note when you're planning your whole class novel unit that the use of backward design is still very, very applicable. You're still going to start by identifying what skills students should know and master by the end of the unit. And then you design a summative assessment to measure that learning. And that may or may not be directly tied to the content or the themes of the whole class novel. And then after that, you go backwards and you start to plan those sequence of events in order to prepare them to successfully complete that assessment. Remember, we're not asking ourselves, what book am I teaching this unit? We are asking ourselves, what skills do students need to master in this unit? The novel is simply a vessel for this learning. It is not the learning itself. It doesn't matter if they can tell you whether or not Hester Prynne said this or another character in the Scarlet Letter. It doesn't matter if they can answer a true or false question about whether or not something happened in the chapter. It's not a gotcha experience. We're using the novel as a tool to help them master reading and writing skills. Okay, that's the whole class approach. Whole class novel approach. This is the blended model, which also has some pros and cons. Pro, it's going to provide students exposure to classic texts all year long, alongside independent reading. It provides some flexibility in what classics you choose because you're not assigning the book to everyone. And so you can stray a little bit from that core novel approved list. There's a really strong emphasis on the transfer of close reading skills, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. and student choice in reading is still honored and maintained. But the cons are that students are not reading text cover to cover, they're reading excerpts of classics. So there's something to be lost there, I think. But with the blended model, 2 of our daily practices still apply. You have students read every day for at least 10 minutes, conferring with those students during that time. Rather than going right into their journal entries or their thought logs, you as the teacher deliver a focused lesson, often based in close reading skills, with a challenging excerpt from that chosen classic. And then you ask students to transfer the skills that you just modeled in that lesson to their choice book. And even better, we're asking students to synthesize the classic with their choice reading. So allow me to model what this focused lesson could look like. Usually it lasts around maybe 8 or 10 minutes at the most. So I'm going to do a very, very, very condensed, simple version of this. If I am using the Scarlet Letter, I have this one of these opening chapters. What you do first is you read the text aloud. You can model your thinking as you read as well. That could be really critical, but most importantly, you're going to model your thinking after you read the text. So let's go ahead and begin. The rust on the ponderous ironwork of its oaken door looked more antique than anything else in the New World. Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed to never have known a youthful era. So my brain is thinking, okay, this door has something to do with crime. It's old. This ugly edifice, ooh, it's not very pretty. And between it and the wheel track of the street was a grass plot, much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, and apple peru, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenital in the soil that had so early borne the black flower of civilized society, a prison. Okay, they're describing the door to a prison, and it's not in very good shape. It's old, there's vegetation that's grown out of it. It's not a very pretty picture. But the word but is always so important in our reading. And I would remind students, yes, the transitions that authors give are usually an indication that something important is coming. But on one side of the portal, and rooted almost at the threshold, was a wild rose bush, covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. And so at this point, you transition to modeling your thinking. My objective with this passage is I want students to be able to identify and analyze symbols or images in text. And so I would remind students that whenever an author takes a significant amount of time to describe something, you know it's important. And students, I'm noticing 2 things that were described: this door and the door to the prison, and this rose bush right next to it. When I think about the way that that prison door was described, he called it ugly. It's overgrown, it's a black flower, but there's another flower. Obviously the black flower is not literal, but there is a literal flower next to it. It's a beautiful rose bush. It offers fragrance. And you might tap into a lesson you've done previously about Puritan culture as we led up to this novel and talk about, hey, the lack of mercy and the rigidness of that societal structure was often devastating to individuals. So I wonder statements are really powerful when modeling our thinking. I wonder if this flower, this rose bush, could symbolize or hint at the beauty of mercy and the beauty of kindness, even amidst stark judgment in this culture, okay? Now that I've modeled my thinking, I would ask students, okay, we're going to spend some time looking in your books. You may need to go back and reread. You may need to read ahead or look back at what you just read during our reading time today. You're going to see if there's an important image that the author spends a lot of time describing, and you're going to analyze that image and make some conclusions about it. So what does this look like when students do this? I'm looking for 2 things when a student is practicing and transferring this skill. Again, the skill is analyzing images and symbolism in text. So I'm looking first, can they make a connection to the classic that I just modeled for them? And they do that here when they say, Nathaniel Hawthorne focuses on the rose near the prison door to show something about Puritanism without just saying it. Okay, would have I liked the student to maybe explain what that something is? Absolutely, but it's a start. Then they start to connect to their book. Andrew Smith does this a lot in The Grasshopper Jungle too. Smith repeats images to show things about his characters. Austin keeps mentioning the Xanax that his and Robbie's moms take, and they call the Xanax kayaks. Okay, there's the image that they've identified. It seems like he might call them kayaks because their moms are kind of floating on the surface and not getting involved. They are basically clueless about what their kids do outside the house. So that's a beautiful example of a student transferring the skill of analyzing symbols to their own text. So how do I choose a classic? It's really depends on the skills that you want students to learn through the novel, and the exact title you choose is not critical. It's really the skills that you want. Remember, you're not teaching students the novel, we're teaching them how to be skilled readers. The classic is the vehicle to get there. So how are you planning these mini lessons each day? Rely heavily on your existing units, ones that you've already planned. I'm sure you have your copy of whatever classic text you've used marked up and dog-eared and underlined, but focus on the skills that that book offers. Once those essential skills are identified, narrow down excerpts from the text to teach. And I've provided an example template that might help you do that, hyperlinked in this slideshow that you can use later. To help narrow down, spy on yourself as a reader when you encounter the text. What are you noticing? What kind of thinking or what kind of reading skills do you use as you're reading and navigating this classic text? And help that formulate, okay, they have this skill here, this skill here, this skill here. There's going to be times when there's a skill that you, or not even a skill, but a technique the author uses that is so beautiful and worthwhile, even if it may not directly apply to most of the students' choice reading. The example I'm thinking of is if I was using Romeo and Juliet or any other Shakespeare play, and I wanted them to learn about iambic pentameter and understand that, I might say Shakespeare uses iambic pentameter to create a rhythm and to emphasize the emotions of the characters in the play. Where does the author in your book provide rhythm, pacing, structure, or where and how does the author highlight the feelings of the characters and what they're going through? And so even though they're not looking for iambic pentameter in their book, they're still connecting to the purpose of iambic pentameter. And so what you're going to find, guys, is if we don't require students to read classics, sometimes they're just going to pick them up on their own with that independent choice. I want to remind you that even if your students, you have classes of students that just aren't ready for the whole class or the blended model, that's okay. When we provide choice, students will pick up classic novels of their own volition. All right, that's our time today, folks. Our final session is going to be all about building a community of readers through book talks and class libraries and surveying students and celebrations of reading progress. So that'll be in March. And as always, dates are subject to change, but plan on March 4th for now. At this time, I'm going to send you guys a copy of the Google form that you can submit for professional learning points for today. But stick around if you want to chat, process, or have any questions. Thank you, everyone.